I am going to talk about something more contemporary, I think, in the digital realm this morning. So, yes, as Richard was saying, I'm Dr. J.T. Welsh. I am in the Department of English and Related Literature. And I want to talk to you a bit about poetry, or specifically political poetry, and what happens and how it moves about in online spaces. So the growth of online literary culture brings all sorts of exciting opportunities, but also challenges, I think, for literary researchers, because it fundamentally changes the way that we access and interact with texts. But I also want to suggest, in my provocation, ways in which digital networks are also starting to actually shape meaning and even the form of poems themselves. So I'll begin by asking you, with apologies, to cast your mind back to the morning of November 9th, 2016, as we all woke up to the news that Donald Trump had been elected President of the United States. And amid the coverage of that shock outcome and its political repercussions, you might have noticed another trend. As the same media outlets that had fed the frenzy of Trump's populist campaign for years previous pivoted into a therapeutic role. So we had places like Newsweek publishing how to survive a Trump presidency, or Teen Vogue explaining how to cope with post-election stress. And even more curiously, they also began prescribing poetry. That very same day, the Huffington Post recommended 18 compassionate poems to help you weather uncertain times. And Vox asked, "Feeling terrible right now? Maybe some poetry will help." BuzzFeed posted Dennis Smith's poem, "You're Dead, America," which had apparently been written overnight in response to the news. And this continued throughout the week. The following day, as mainstream outlets caught up with The Guardian offering words of solace and strength, poems to counter the election fallout, CNN suggested that the poet Langston Hughes is helping people get through the election. And the heralding generally of poetry's resurgence continued throughout the rest of the year. "Don't look now," Wired magazine quipped, but 2016 is resurrecting poetry. Understandably, this resurrection was met with some ambivalence from poets themselves, and others, like me, who had dedicated their lives to promoting the relevance of this relatively marginal literary form. The American poet Jane Hirshfield hinted at these mixed feelings in the New York Times, admitting, quote, "Poems are visible right now, which is terribly ironic because you rather wish it weren't so necessary." So on one hand, yay, people are reading poetry. On the other hand, could it not be for a better reason? So looking at this broader phenomenon, I want to look at a particular poem that went viral in 2016, suggesting some ways that scholars might approach online literature. But before that, I just want to take a step back and look briefly at this metaphor itself of going viral. So first, we should note that for Douglas Rushkoff, the media theorist who coined this usage in his 1994 polemic "Media Virus!" Hidden Agendas in Popular Culture, it wasn't a metaphor at all. He writes, "These media events are not like viruses, they are viruses." So this is well before social media takes the form that we have now, and he's thinking about this viral activity. It's worth remembering then that Rushkoff's conception of virality is overwhelmingly negative. And in many ways, it's a throwback to older theories of mass media infecting consumers and pushing hidden agendas without their knowledge. So one observation we might make is that contemporary notions of going viral are much more positive. It's something any content maker might aspire to, and even those in marketing might even study and plan to go viral. Media coverage focuses invariably on the welcome attention, turning Rushkoff's metaphor completely on its head. All the negative connotations of biological viruses or even computer viruses have been completely detached from this understanding of viral content. Secondly, you might have noticed the lack of any clear definition for viral content. Is 1,000 Facebook likes enough? 10,000 retweets? Instead, the absence of any specific threshold puts journalists in a very convenient position, with the authority to grant viral status to any photo, social media post, or any other content by way of their own commentary. In other words, if they say it's viral, it's viral. And this points to online media's most literally virus-like quality, I think, its ability to self-replicate. So rather than imagine viral media as pertaining to the transmission of a single piece of content out to its audience, commentary around that original content adapts its genetic code, as it were, and spreads. And in this regard, virality and going viral has much less to do with the number of likes or shares than its potential for generating further content. Finally, I want to note the passive grammatical construction of this phrase, going viral. It implies that this is something that happens of its own accord, that the content is so inherently interesting that it simply found its audience. In that way, the metaphor masks the attention economy at work here. The value of research into online literary culture depends, I think, on uncovering the machinery and the algorithms and the forces obscured by this implied passivity. For example, on the 15th of June, 2016, a poem called Good Bones by the American poet Maggie Smith, so not that Maggie Smith, but that Maggie Smith, was published in the relatively small, unknown poetry magazine Waxwing. And I won't read the whole poem out, but it's basically a poem in which a speaker worries about raising her children in a world where bad things happen. No specific events are named. It's more of a general sense that, quote, life is short and the world is at least 50% terrible. And the speaker admits, I keep this from my children. It's a great poem. I encourage you to look it up. And you might have even seen it already at some point. Remember seeing it on one of your own social media feeds. Here's how it got there. The following day, a writer in Seattle named Shira Ehrlichman came across Good Bones in Waxwing magazine and posted it on Twitter, tagging the author and including a screenshot that she had taken with her phone. And again, we can notice that the very general poem is accompanied by what is now the standard form of what we might think of as an anti-commentary, just the word this, merely calling attention to it. But it was this tweet that was then shared by people like Caitlin Moran, Charlotte Church, and thousands of others with their major influencers who brought the poem to the attention of their hundreds of thousands of followers. It went viral. Within 2 days of its publication, the poem had not only gone viral, but acquired a specific context, with Slate magazine describing it as having been published in the wake of the Orlando shooting. The nightclub shooting in Orlando had taken place on the 12th of June, although the poet admits in this same interview that it was written well before and without any specific event in mind. But it's this adaptability that proves essential to its viral potential. That very same day, on this side of the Atlantic, The Guardian had its own article about the poem, where it was described as having gone viral in the wake of this week's tragedies. Aside from the Orlando shooting 3 days before the poem had been published, the MP Joe Cox had been murdered the day after it was published, on the 16th of June, and the same day that it went viral on Twitter. By December, the headline in the Washington Post described it as the poem that captured the mood of a tumultuous year, expanding its applicability to the EU referendum, Trump's election, and everything else that went wrong in 2016. It's exciting to me to see the ways in which literary scholars might work across disciplines in ways that the HRC encourages and supports, building on our understanding of publication and material print histories while working towards a better understanding of the technologies, the psychology, the social dynamics, the industry structures, and the economics behind these headlines championing poetry's popularity. At a most basic level, we can return to a poem like Good Bones and note how neatly its form fits a smartphone screen for taking a screenshot or easy reading, or how its ambiguous content enhances its viral potential. And there's clearly more work to do to understand how the experience of literature changes when readers are encountering it in so many different contexts, juxtaposed with so much other content online or targeted ads or on screens of different sizes. But I just want to finish by returning to one of those headlines from after Trump's election. This particular article from The Guardian offered words of solace and strength to counter the election fallout. And it included, amongst other poems, one by Adrienne Rich, and used her photo as its main illustration. I think we can safely say that Rich, a wonderful, deeply politically committed poet who died in 2012, would have had very mixed feelings about this use of her poetry and image. When she declined the National Endowment of the Arts Medal in 1997, she explained, "Poetry means nothing if it simply decorates the dinner table of power which holds it hostage." In this light, studying poetry's value and function online also means understanding the extent to which its meaning risks being lost if it simply decorates our news feeds. Thank you.
Thanks, that was absolutely fascinating. A couple of questions spring to mind. How does this, obviously the 20th century has seen this huge debate on the moral value or lack of the arts, which I think probably Nazism, for most famously exploded. In what sense does this shed a new light on that discussion, particularly as, in the light of your last comments, is a viral, diversified, social media supported invocation of poetry really a table of power, or is it something else?
It's complicated. I mean, is the short answer. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been doing, and it's been exciting to see starting to happen across disciplines, is to think about the structures of these outlets themselves, to not treat all this content the same. That the way that that things end up on The Guardian is quite different from the way that things end up on BuzzFeed, and quite different from the way things end up on Facebook. And so the power is different in those different cases, and the funding models and the business models are very different behind them. And it's that kind of work, I think, more and more will be needed because. I mean, it's in some ways it's no different than different publishing models in print. That there were people, but I think a lot of the rhetoric around these things and the kind of the entrepreneurial discourse, especially the idea that either poets or these publishers who are setting up these new outlets are doing this positive kind of business creative industries thing. It's entangled with these questions of power and who's benefiting from all of these clicks. Yeah. So.
Do you have anything to say about the longer debate on the moral value or neutrality of John Kerry stuff?
Yeah, I know. I think it's in this case. I think it's something that poets are really grappling with at the moment, finding ways that it doesn't seem like they're just ambulance chasing or feeding off of these kind of political or personal traumas in different ways, and I think that's the response. And so I guess my own sense is that it's good that it's visible and that those conversations are happening in visible ways, even if that visibility is there's an exploited side to it. Yeah.
Thanks. That was really, really interesting. But what I was wanting to kind of push you on was the way in which almost all the media framing of this verse was turning literature into therapy. And I'd be interested to know what you make of that kind of therapeutic value of the aesthetic. But also, in particular, I'm kind of thinking about how much stuff there is being promoted at the moment and being embraced by sections of the cultural industries about social prescribing, or about poetic prescribing, or about singing for your health, whereby actually all of this kind of creative activity is being instrumentalized, but also seems to be harking back to a kind of Arnoldian. This is about creating a particular harmonious society, and that seems to me to raise some pretty worrying questions about how we're allowing the humanities to get framed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think poetry can sweep in and make up for cuts to the NHS, for instance. I mean, I think that, and the rhetoric around a lot of self-care and wellness often is putting the pressure on the person themselves to look after themselves and to make up for, you know, the collapse of communal and welfare support. And I think that to me, that feels like the danger here as well, that if poetry leaps too easily onto this role of kind of you know, raising awareness for political situations and causes. At the same time, I mean, it sort of links back to that previous question. I think there is something about poetry. It clearly does. It transmits in a different way. And you know, while sales of fiction have been falling, sales of poetry have risen every year for the past 4 years. And I think there is something that poetry can do to loosen up some of this language and question some of this rhetoric that's out there that's putting that kind of pressure on individuals to, you know, do their own therapy in this way. But it can't. Yeah, I think it is. There's a danger if it presents itself as this cure-all, and that you know, a poem a day will keep anything bad away. I don't think. Yeah.
Thank you. That was just great. My English teacher told me that my talents were more linguistic than literary. And he was quite right. So my question's a bit of a different tack. I was really struck by the relationship between the form of the poem and the technology that was used. And I was also struck by at least what seemed to me to be quite a difference between you know, the heavy metal of the thin ice press and the slim iPhone. I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit about what's the relationship between the medium and the form, and whereby form I mean the kind of technology that we use for reading. And I ask this as an innocent, really.
Yeah. That's a big question. I think there's a lot more of those kinds of like casual observations about, oh, that's the shape of an iPhone. You know, there are other poems that are using lots longer lines than we've seen since Whitman or Ginsberg, and I think it's because of the way that lines wrap around on the screen and they don't respect the line breaks of traditional lyric poetry and things like that. I think that kind of formal analysis is an area to bridge that gap maybe, and to kind of think about that, to not make a binary distinction between kind of material, historical, print culture and digital, that digital has its own materiality and it has its own ontology, and to think about those reading experiences in a really tactile, embodied sense, to think about, you know, and that varies, that every, you know, person will have their different experience. They might have their settings reversed so that the screen's black and the text's white, or they're looking at it, you know, and the typeface is changing for accessibility reasons, and all these different kinds of functionalities that, so I think it's drawing on those same techniques that we've used to look at manuscripts for a long time, to look at these in these digital contexts.
Thanks, that was really fantastic. So can I ask a bit about your claim that there's no standard threshold, so something's viral if we say it's viral? So the philosopher in me wants to ask a really picky question here.
Good. Okay.
Which is that, right, so could it just be that it's contextual whether something's viral, right? So there's no standard threshold for whether something's flat, right? But nonetheless, something isn't flat just if we say it's flat, right? There's broad agreement, it just varies from context to context. So the slightly broader question, which is hopefully not the philosopher's question, is I was kind of interested why this is important, right? Why there might be this kind of disagreement about whether or not something counts as viral.
Yeah, good phenomenological. Yeah, I mean, you know, the slightly flippant like context in which I've thought, it's like, could you put in an impact case study that something of yours had gone viral? Would that be a meaningful metric in any sense? And it's a silly but serious question is that, because that emphasis on metrics that comes through, and that's, in some ways, that's the way that these algorithms are entirely working now, is based on clicks. That's why we're seeing so much poetry online, is because these formulas are making decisions based on absolute kind of numbers. So, yeah, I still do come back that it serves a rhetorical function, and that different people, there's a benefit to having that kind of tag that they can put on something, just like other kinds of language, and the way people talk about signal boosting and different kinds of things that happens in that chain. I don't know. It feels to me like that the ambiguity of it is so useful to the people who use that language that it will remain slippery in that sense. And it's all relative, because poetry is something that if anybody reads it at all, it's sort of relatively viral, it feels like. Yeah.